Hello everyone, I'm Sarah Cassidy and I lead a research group in the School of Psychology at the University of Nottingham, aiming to better understand and prevent mental health problems, suicidal thoughts and behaviours in partnership with autistic people. In this presentation, I will talk about the implications of the double empathy problem for understanding development and mental health in autistic and non-autistic people, and how research, support and society should change to improve well-being. This presentation will discuss research relating to suicidal thoughts and behaviours, so if this does not feel like the right time for you to listen to this content now, be assured that this presentation is recorded and it will be made publicly available after the conference, so you can listen at another time at your own pace if you wish. It's so important that research addresses the issues that are important to autistic people, and that means that it will be more likely to make a meaningful and positive difference to autistic people's lives. And to facilitate this, we've been really fortunate and very grateful to be supported by a number of different funders to work in partnership with autistic people and those who support them to identify the top 10 priorities for future suicide prevention efforts. And many of these priorities listed here include things like understanding risk and protective factors and models explaining why autistic people might feel suicidal to help inform suicide prevention strategies that are appropriate with and for autistic people. And this presentation will review a body of work aiming to address these particular community priorities and next steps for research and society to help improve outcomes with and for autistic people. So this presentation will summarise our recent review, which is open access, and the full reference is at the bottom of this slide here. So if you want to know more, please feel free to download and read our paper. But I'll discuss evidence suggesting that autistic people are misperceived by the neurotypical majority in society, and I'm going to discuss how this could help explain the high rates of mental health problems, suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviours in autistic people. I'll also discuss how research, society and clinical practice will need to change in light of these important research findings, which challenge the best deficit-based approaches and narrative to understanding autism and supporting autistic people that's traditionally plagued autism research. And I'll also reflect on how participatory research, that's research conducted in partnership with autistic people, has led to these new important insights, and therefore how important it is to continue working in partnership with autistic people, to continue to identify and address unanswered questions and help make meaningful, positive change happen together. So traditionally, research has located difficulties associated with autism within autistic people, within the autistic individual, with the assumption that these difficulties could be treated or even cured. But this view has been challenged. The double empathy problem proposed by Milton, for example, asserts that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they will struggle to empathise with each other. Therefore, not only will autistic people have difficulty empathising with non-autistic people, but also non-autistic people, the neurotypical majority in society, will also have difficulty empathising with autistic people. So the double empathy problem therefore predicts that non-autistic people will have difficulties empathising, communicating and interacting with autistic people. So is there evidence in support of the double empathy problem theory? Do non-autistic people find it difficult to communicate and interact with autistic people and vice versa? Catherine Crompton and colleagues addressed this question really cleverly by comparing the proportion of correct details in a story that was communicated along a chain of people. And they found that the most efficient communication of information happened where there was a chain which consisted of all autistic people, whereas the most inefficient communication of information was in a mixed chain of autistic and non-autistic people. So they found that autistic peer-to-peer information transfer is highly effective, suggesting that autistic people have a unique communication style which is more readily understandable by other non-autistic people compared with other autistic people. And this is consistent with the double empathy problem theory. Another study by Noah Sasson and colleagues videoed autistic and non-autistic people in a brief conversation and showed these videos to non-autistic raters. And those non-autistic people tended to rate these brief videos of autistic people as significantly less socially favourable than non-autistic peers, just on a basis of very brief sample of behaviour. And this suggests that non-autistic people tend to misperceive autistic people very early on in an interaction. You can see that here. A lot of these red bars are significantly lower than the blue bars, which shows that non-autistic people rated autistic people much lower in things like attractiveness, dominance, likability, whether they were likely to want to talk to that person, sit next to them, hang out with them, and rated them as significantly more awkward as well than non-autistic people. In another study by Shepherd and colleagues, autistic and non-autistic people were videoed while reacting to social situations such as a joke, compliment, waiting for the experimenter to start the study, or being told a story. And then non-autistic people viewed these brief videotape reactions and tried to guess what actually happened to the person. So did the person in the video hear a joke, receive a compliment, and so on? And they didn't know who in the videos was autistic or non-autistic. But nevertheless, the results indicated, as shown in this graph here, that non-autistic people found it more difficult to guess what happened to autistic people than other non-autistic people. And you can see that here. So with the non-autistic people viewing these videos, they were significantly less likely to correctly guess if autistic people in the videos were waiting, if they'd been told a story or been told a compliment. But there's no difference for the joke social situation. And this suggests that non-autistic people again have difficulty interpreting the behaviour of autistic people. A follow-on study by the same group, but led by Al-Khaldi and colleagues, found that non-autistic people also tended to rate those that they found hard to read, those that they found difficult to tell what actually happened to them, as less likeable. Therefore, non-autistic people appear to have difficulty interpreting the behaviour of autistic people, and this could also explain, at least in part, why non-autistic people also tend to rate autistic people as less socially favourable. And you can see this association here, where these dark grey dots in the bottom left tend to have low readability and also lower social favourability than non-autistic people, which are the light grey triangles in the top right, which tend to have higher readability and slightly higher social favourability as well. So in summary, there is evidence in support of the double empathy problem. Communication is more efficient between autistic people compared to autistic and non-autistic people, and this suggests that autistic people have a unique communication style which is difficult for non-autistic people to interpret. Non-autistic people tend to rate autistic people socially unfavourably based on very limited information, suggesting a strong early bias on the part of non-autistic people interacting with autistic people. And non-autistic people find it difficult to interpret the behaviour of autistic people, and also non-autistic people may rate autistic people unfavourably because they find them difficult to read. So how do these misperceptions impact on the development of autistic and non-autistic people? The figure here describes what could happen. So first, how the behaviour of autistic people is perceived by neurotypical others, likely negatively, influences how they behave towards autistic people, which is unwelcoming. And that's then perceived by autistic people that they are not welcome. And that then impacts on the behaviour of autistic people. Perhaps they're wary, perhaps they have mistrust, low self-esteem, lack of social ability due to lack of positive and rewarding social experiences with the neurotypical majority in society. And that in turn will impact on how autistic people are then perceived by neurotypical others, negatively even more, and so on, and the cycle continues. So because neurotypical people are unwelcoming towards autistic people and exclude them socially, they do not then tend to learn to interpret their autism-specific style of social interaction, and that might serve to further perpetuate their misunderstanding and misperception. So it's a vicious circle that keeps going on and on. So it's really imperative, if we are to change things, to try and close this empathy gap and think about improving non-autistic people's ability and also inclination to empathise with autistic people. So what's the impact of being misperceived on the mental health of autistic people? Many theories stress how important a sense of belonging in the world is for protecting against mental health problems and suicidal thoughts. And that's what's outlined in this model called the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide, which posits that a feeling of thwarted belongingness, so not feeling like you belong in the world, can increase risk of mental health problems and even suicidal thoughts. However, being misperceived by the neurotypical majority in society could make autistic people feel as if they do not belong in the world, and that could increase, according to this theory, risk of mental health problems and suicidal thoughts. So our work has shown, consistent with this theory, that autistic people and those with high autistic traits who aren't diagnosed as autistic but nevertheless have a high number of autistic traits that are common with autistic people, they're both more likely to experience thwarted belonging, which increases their risk of experiencing suicidal thoughts. Many autistic people also report a really strong awareness of not being accepted for who they are in society. And in response to this, attempt to try and camouflage their autistic traits and characteristics in an effort to fit in and access social spaces in a society that's essentially not built for people like them. However, autistic people also describe, like in this co-designed qualitative study, that camouflaging has many unintended consequences, such as not being accepted for one's true autistic self, mental health problems, etc. Whereas being recognised as autistic, being diagnosed, being understood and accepted reduces the pressure to camouflage. And in another co-designed study, camouflaging was described by our autistic steering group as a really important factor in their experiences of feeling suicidal. And this was really strongly reflected in responses to the large online survey, where camouflaging was a significant independent risk marker for suicidality in autistic adults. And that was over and above a number of other factors controlled for in the model, such as employment, satisfaction with living arrangements, co-occurring developmental conditions, depression and anxiety. And our further research has also found that camouflaging one's autistic traits can have the unintended consequence of feeling like you're not accepted for your true self, and that's consistent with our earlier qualitative study. And that also increases risk of feeling as though you don't belong in the world, which in turn is associated with increased risk of feeling suicidal. So bringing all of this different kind of new, exciting and really important research findings together, no research has actually yet directly tested the impact of autistic people being misperceived on mental health. But this proposed model here is a starting point for discussion and also future research that might begin to address this really important issue. So this model here predicts that autistic people respond to being misperceived by the neurotypical majority in society by trying to camouflage their autistic traits and characteristics to fit in, which increases their likelihood of not being accepted for their true self, feelings of thwarted belongingness, not being accepted in society or in the world, and that could potentially increase likelihood of experiencing mental health problems and suicidality. We also predicted in this model that individual differences, because we're all different and there are really huge individual differences in the general population in autistic people in lots of other groups. And so we also predicted that individual differences will moderate and affect these associations in the model. So a few examples here are perhaps motivation to be socially accepted by others could affect whether a person attempts to camouflage their autistic characteristics to fit in, and perhaps insight into one's own difficulties. For example, knowing that despite your best efforts to camouflage to try and fit in, that this hasn't worked and you're still experiencing social exclusion, perhaps that could further increase risk of experiencing thwarted belongingness. But this model, it's needs to have further discussion and consideration of other factors, say for instance autistic identity, disclosure of diagnosis to others, social satisfaction, social support, stigma, autistic burnout. The possibilities are endless. There are also other very important and unanswered questions. So, for example, given that non-autistic people tend to misperceive autistic people, could interventions be designed to help non-autistic people better empathise and interact with autistic people? And fortunately, there is excellent work happening on this topic now, such as by Chones and colleagues that was published this year, but we definitely need further work in this area. And another question is, that hasn't really been extensively looked at in research, is do family members, such as parents and siblings or professionals who support autistic people, show the same biases when rating or interacting with autistic people? Or are these differences or biases attenuated? Are they weaker? There's some initial evidence that first impressions of autistic adults improve if the autistic adult's diagnosis is disclosed, and particularly in the case when the rater, the perceiver, has pre-existing autism knowledge. Therefore, there seems to be some kind of impact, positive impact, that if you have pre-existing autism knowledge and you know that the person's autistic, that you make some positive, you take some things into account and adjust your views. And there also appears to be some degree of understanding between autistic people and their family members through previous research. So the double empathy problem posits that it is difficulties in the interpersonal space between autistic people and others in their environment, which affects autistic people's outcomes. So how do features of the self and the social environment interact to determine outcomes such as mental health? Is it, for example, the case that autistic people who are living in a more accepting environment have better outcomes in terms of more positive mental health than those who don't, for example? So how should society change? Well, the medical model has predominated, which views autism as a set of difficulties intrinsic to an individual which must be cured or treated. But interventions could therefore, according to this model, in light of the double empathy problem and these findings, could therefore have inadvertently encouraged things such as camouflaging, making autistic people feel like they're not accepted, making them more likely to experience thwarted belongingness and subsequently poor mental health. But the double empathy problem, in contrast, supported by more recent research, suggests a shared societal responsibility to be accepting of diversity, which could benefit everybody, particularly autistic people, and it's crucial that we close that empathy gap. However, it's really important to remember that it would not be helpful for society to impose social experiences upon autistic people who differ widely in motivation to socialise or not, and that's totally fine. And these revelations have come through participatory research, and solutions and change will therefore likely only be found in partnership too. So it's absolutely imperative that we continue to work together. So thank you so much to my collaborators, my funders, all the participants who took part, our community partners who have joined us on this important journey to better understand and prevent mental health problems and suicide in partnership with autistic people. Please check out my website and feel free to email me any questions, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it interesting, helpful. Please take care and stay safe.